Sharon Main. I'm the Director of Climate Resilience of the Community Environmental Council. And I want to take a moment before we start and really root ourselves in place. The Pacific Ocean, the California coast, the Central Coast, Santa Barbara County, Goleta, and more specifically, on the banks of the historic Goleta Bay. Also part of the traditional lands of the Chimeta Nation, one of many, but certainly an important area. This map here really shows the extent of the bay that was once here. There was an island in the middle of the bay, marked with that E there. That was where a very large Chumash village was once located. Hilo was the name, in the middle of the bay, and the people who lived and inhabited this place, this beautiful space, interacted with the land and the sea for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived in the 1500s. In about the mid-1800s, a large fire, this will sound familiar to all of us, on the hillsides here, followed by extreme weather, heavy rains. There was a massive debris flow, which then filled in a great part of this bay. The new land that was created, there was agriculture that was then on that land afterwards. And then later the island, unfortunately, was cut away and used as fill, which made our roads and our airport. So all that remains of this little bit of an island now is out at the wastewater treatment plant. There's a little bit of a bump out there. So I just want to show you now a little bit of an animation here. So I took that traditional footprint that we have of course, our airport in this Goleta area and where the bay was, and overlaid it here with what a projected 6.5-foot sea level rise looks like with our 100-year storm events. Notice obviously the same footprint we have here. Really pretty dramatic. Helps us kind of put things in perspective. This is another really great map. I didn't want to put it static so you didn't have to see that movement going on and on here. But really, I'd like to acknowledge the Chumash people, the Chumash Nation, who have always been here to see and experience the changes of the land and the sea. They have a very long trajectory of knowledge and understanding that I think that we must honor. And so to our Chumash brothers and sisters, to the elders, and to the wise ones past, present, and future, to those who have long interacted harmoniously with the land and the sea and who have been the stewards of this place, we thank you and welcome your wisdom as we work together really to find solutions to sea level rise and adapting to it. So that was my brief moment to root us. I'd like to introduce Heather Bennett, Vice President of Partnership and Philanthropy for Direct Relief, as our welcome this morning.
Thank you so much for not only gathering to try to address this pressing issue, but for gathering here at Direct Relief. We're very honored that you've selected our facility. As you know, I hope you know, you might not know, Direct Relief is a disaster response organization, and more frequently over the past several years, we've responded to a lot of disasters that are direct results of climate change. A lot of the flooding, a lot of the hurricanes, earthquakes, fires. We met here in November to talk about wildfires, and now talking about flooding. It's very close to our heart. We take a public health view on things like this, but we're very grateful for everyone in this room, in this community, to really come together to try to solve this issue. So thank you so much, and welcome to Direct Relief.
Thanks, Heather. I want to get a quick show of hands. Direct Relief generously offers a tour of their facility, which is amazing, and we'll do that during the break. I want to just get a sense so they can know how many people have ready. How many of us might be interested in such a tour? Paul, does that help you? Okay, great, thank you. All right, we'll give you an announcement about how to do that later, but that just gives us a sense of how to prepare, so thank you. One final note before I introduce our first speaker. It is coronavirus time of the year. I would like to let us know that we should probably be taking extra precautions, and I'm certainly guilty of this morning already. It's difficult for me to say this in a network gathering event, but let's avoid too much contact. So maybe some fist bumps rather than handshakes. And of course, wash your hands thoroughly, and we have some sanitizers around. And of course, be careful touching your face. So my little public health warning here just to remind us. So, with no further ado, I would like to now, bring up Sigrid Wright, who is our Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of the Community Environmental Council.
All right, thank you, Sharon. I've already broken your rule many times. I've had to most of you in the room. So thank you for being here. We had 121 RSVPs and had to cut off a while ago. So congratulations for making it. In the room today, we have nonprofit leaders, funders, local government staff, as well as a number of electeds who have RSVP'd. I haven't seen all of you yet, but a particular thank you for coming in the day after a big election day. Second District County Supervisor Greg Hart, if you're here, you can stand up. Mayor of Carpinteria, Wade Nomura. Councilmember, City of Carpinteria, Fred Shaw. Councilmember, City of Santa Barbara, Eric Friedman. And Rita School Board Member, Corinne Izal. Yes. We also have representatives from Congressman Carbajal, Assemblymember Monique Limon, and First District County Board of Supervisors, Doss Williams. You welcome them as well. Thank you. My job this morning is to ground us in the story of climate change for our region. And particularly, I'm going to start with just a quick recap. Some of you have already heard this, so I'll be very brief, of the results of the fourth California Climate Assessment. And it was the first one with a regional focus. This one came out about a year and a half ago, and it, for the first time, identified the climate threats for the Central Coast. So you will see wildfire and smoke, sea level rise, heat, drought, heavy rain events, and reduction in water supply, reduction in snowpack, which of course affects our water supply. So we have designed this series to look at the cumulative and cascading effects of those threats, including the interconnected disasters like the ones that we've unfortunately seen. And once again, we are focusing on a timely topic today, as King Tides from earlier in the month gave a sneak preview of what's to come. This topic is finally seeping into the community discussion. I'm going to be showing you some slides that are with our photos from Channel Keeper's local King Tides project. Other reasons to be having this conversation today, and as the community conversation kind of emerges, this May UCSB Arts and Lectures will be bringing author Elizabeth Rush, whose book Rising is a UCSB Reads book for the year. So that's a great accomplishment in getting this conversation going. You'll have a chance to win a copy of that book later today. In addition, TEDx Santa Barbara is hosting a number of interactive events this year on sea level rise. So if you're interested in that, I think you have some information in the back where you can go to TEDxSantaBarbara.com. And then really, we're going to dig into this today. The local agencies are actively working on sea level rise plans, which need strong community input. The City of Goleta and County of Santa Barbara are working through their general plan and element updates to lay the groundwork for sea level rise adaptation. And the City of Santa Barbara has drafted a plan and is preparing this spring to roll out adaptation strategies for public review. The City of Carpinteria is the furthest along and has adopted a sea level rise adaptation plan and is now currently looking at how new development projects may be affected. So when planning this series, so there's the harbor. When planning this series, we really wrestled with how and when to tackle this particular topic. When many people think about sea level rise, we think of it as a slow-moving phenomenon, something to worry about at the end of the century. But there are a few reasons that really emerged for why we need to have this conversation now. And one of them is just the unique geographic constraint of the South Coast. We are on this kind of narrow little strip with mountains and wildlands on one side and the ocean on the other side. So within our team, we talk about that as the climate squeeze. As we deal with wildfire and debris flows on one end, sea level rise and flooding, lowland flooding on the other end, we need to plan for how we work and live in the middle, and that's going to take time. The second reason is that significant housing and much of our critical infrastructure is at risk from rising seas. We have low-lying neighborhoods in Goleta Old Town, Isla Vista, East Beach, and elsewhere. We also have an unusual amount of critical infrastructure, so Highway 101, the railroad tracks, the wastewater treatment plants, both of them, the desal plant, and the airport, as we've just seen from Sharon. One of those alone would be enough to deal with, and the fact is that we're not going to be the only coastal community in California that will be in this boat, so to speak. So money may be difficult to come by to find for major infrastructure or retreat efforts, but by planning early, we will be, I think we'll be in better position. The third reason for needing to have this conversation now is that we are a beach community and that we will need to plan for fewer beaches. The ocean and coast are part of our community identity, which are really woven into our way of life. And there's a psychic impact to all of this. One of just many ways we rely on beaches, they are where we go to cool when we have extreme heat events. So we may need time to plan and develop other natural cooling areas. And the fourth, and I'm sure not the last, but the last one that I'll address, is that we need to have this conversation now because when it comes to sea level rise, Santa Barbara will be one small piece of a much bigger story as people around the world seek refuge from heat or from drought or are forced to retreat from their own coastal communities, including major cities like San Francisco, LA, New York City, and other, Shanghai, Mumbai, the list goes on and on. Global estimates for climate refugees are staggering, and it's unpredictable in terms of, in regards to where people can and will go. So, to wrap that up, that was cheerful. To wrap that up, it's clear that we really need, I'm going to bring this back up, to look at the big picture and get organized for significant collaboration. Many of you are working on key pieces of climate planning, adaptation, or resilience, whether that's fire, flood, sea level rise, land use, land management, forest health, transportation, public health, social justice. But often that really good work gets siloed and within and among agencies, and non-government efforts and other voices are not always incorporated. In fact, sometimes we leave out critical voices. So to that end, we are hoping that you will continue with us as a cohort through the entire roundtable series, even when the focus is outside of your core expertise or experience. Our next roundtable in late May or early June will be on heat and drought and will be in the mid or north county. And as we appear to be heading back into drought conditions, we may well be in an increasingly long fire season. We really are going to have to pay attention on all flanks. So our challenge today is to think bigger and recognize that we're all in this together, and we hope that you will continue with us. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Carrie Capel, and along with Carl Palmer here, we'll be your facilitators for the day. We're here from Legacy Works Group, which is a local nonprofit that empowers community-driven change. Our purpose is to facilitate and manage collaborative efforts like this one to help communities and groups tackle complex challenges and work together to address critical needs. So today's event is a true roundtable, as Sigrid said. We have a set of speakers to help us set the context at the beginning, but most of the day is really going to be spent in conversation. And so we really invite you to dig into that. We're here to better understand what we're facing as a community and make sense of that, and then give voice to our collective perspectives and experiences, and together lift up potential solutions that we can work on as a network. I invite you to participate fully and really bring your voice to the process and all of your personal gifts. It's really essential that when faced with complex challenges, we're able individually and as groups to make sense of those challenges and to come to conclusions that are really grounded in facts. But all too often as people, we quickly jump to conclusions that are based on our past experience or our beliefs. So as a framing for today, we're going to use a simple tool called What, So What, Now What, just to help deliberately move us through that process of confronting the facts, making sense of them, and drawing out patterns and observations, and then moving into drawing conclusions and articulating potential solutions. So that will be sort of the arc of the day. And in front of you, you have a worksheet that just has that what, so what, now what, and some prompting questions. I invite you to just use that for your own purposes, to take notes during the presentations if you are a note taker, and then we will return to it again in one of the exercises later. But the first section, the what, is really for the facts. What did you observe? What reactions or emotions did you notice in yourself or others around you, and what facts stood out to you? Really try to be deliberate about facts going there before you move into the so what. So why does that feel important? What patterns or conclusions are emerging? What hypotheses does it bring up for you? And then later in the day, we'll get into the now what, the conclusions and actions that we might take. You also have in front of you an agenda, and I'll just quickly orient you to that. This first session before the coffee break will have 2 keynote speakers and a brief table exercise, and what we're calling a flash panel, where we have some other perspectives that we're going to invite from key guests today. We'll have a coffee break around 10, and then it'll be about 20 minutes. We'll come back at 10:20, and we'll start by sharing an important new coordination effort around climate action that's taking place, led by the county, and then we'll have the last of our keynotes, which will really get into the now what. And then we'll work together through a series of table level exercises about building resilience to sea level rise in our county. We will synthesize and share next steps at 12, and then lunch will be served at 12:30 outside in the patio. We also have some other resources and tools that we'll showcase at that time, and I really invite you to stay for lunch and beyond. We have this space for the whole afternoon, and it's a great opportunity to network with folks who are here in the room. We also have tool demonstrations, and we are inviting a new opportunity this time around, an unconferencing portion after lunch, where we invite you to propose, propose a topic that you would like to talk to other folks in this room about. And you can choose a table and invite people to your table after lunch and facilitate conversation. We've already had a couple of those ideas proposed. I will remind you of this again in the coffee break, but we'll have a place where you can sign up and put down a topic that you'd like to talk to people about. If you get a little critical mass, you can use this opportunity to advance conversations for collaboration and learning. So that is the arc of the agenda. Our goals with the whole Resilience Roundtable are really to connect critical players across our community and build trust and strengthen this network we have for collective action. To also broaden and deepen that network, to invite in new voices and unusual partnerships, and really get people working across those silos, across the boundaries. We are also really seeking to engage underrepresented voices and invite new perspectives into the conversation. Throughout the series, we're working to identify gaps and opportunities and generate solutions, with a hopeful end goal of really coming together around a collaborative vision for the county. So today, specifically, we want to elevate interconnections between sea level rise and these other threats, which all interact for our region. To connect and coordinate and really leverage the many different efforts that are underway already. Identify gaps that maybe are not being addressed by those ongoing efforts, and new possibilities that we can work on together. And showcase some examples of solutions that are already being enacted by other communities, and generate and collect your ideas here. We will we have a number of mechanisms to harvest
great to be with you here today. I'm just going to briefly touch on our principles for the day. Doing this kind of complex collaborative work requires us to step out of our normal ways of working within organizations, within agencies, often within silos. So these principles are really critical for us to be able to make that elemental shift. So we invite you to be present. We really encourage you to put your phone away, turn it off. If you're a fire chief, you're allowed to keep it on. But otherwise, I'm not sure you are. We invite you to take off your hat. And that, we mean that quite literally. Come here as an individual, as a whole person, not as a role or as somebody who has a particular job. But bring your whole self to this event today. Bring your great intellect, bring your creativity, bring your heart, your emotions, bring your spirit. We invite you to stay open, curious, and committed to learning throughout this whole process. None of us have the answers. I'll say it again. None of us have the answers to this challenge. No single entity, no single person can. But collectively, we have all the pieces that we need in order to be able to put that puzzle together and move forward towards a really resilient future. We're going to work hard to ensure that all voices are welcomed, honored, and heard. So your voice is entirely welcome, and we need it to be here today in order to stitch that book together that's going to bring us to the vision that Carrie shared. We want this to be a safe space for everyone. We want you to be able to share fully, so we also want you to carry things away. But please do not attribute specific statements to people without their permission to do so. All right, I'm just going to say a couple more very brief things about the principles before we introduce Patrick, our first speaker. Let me just make sure. Accelerate is like we hear this. Let me do the housekeeping. I think we've hit all the important things. We'll emphasize those principles throughout. Brief housekeepings. There's a lot of exits if you need to get out. The bathrooms are in the back corner over here if you haven't seen them yet. There'll be a break at 10 or so, depending on how we do our timekeeping. Probably about a 15 or 20-minute coffee break in the middle, and then we'll have lunch at 12:30 from 12:30 to 1:30. Carrie mentioned the unconference opportunity at the end. Be thinking about ideas, and then we'll put up a sheet. We'll put up on that door over there, so you can jot ideas down before the break. There's a photographer in the room, and we're doing some videography. If you would not like your photo included in anything that's published, digitally or otherwise, pull your little name card out and just put a little X on your name tag, and we'll honor that. We'll make sure that when we get those back at the end of the day, that we log that you would rather not be famous. And then we'll have some social media hashtags and whatnot. We'll put those up at the break, but again, we invite you not to do, not to tweet, not to Insta, whatever you like to do until the breaks. Great. If you need any assistance, we have CEC staff members and board members and folks. Table captains, CEC folks, raise your hand. There should be one at every table. If there's not, we'll find you one. But seek someone out who looks smart and CEC. All right, wonderful. Well, without further ado, I'll hand it back to Carrie to introduce our first speaker.
So Dr. Patrick Barnard is a coastal geologist with the USGS Pacific Coast and Marine Science Center in Santa Cruz. He serves on numerous regional, national, and international scientific review panels related to climate change and coastal hazards, and has advised members of Congress and the cabinet, state and local government representatives on this threat. Patrick's research has been published in over 80 peer-reviewed scientific papers in numerous esteemed journals, and he's presented at over 100 conferences all over the world on this topic. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Patrick Barnard with us today to help sober us up or light a fire under us about sea level rise and its impacts.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's really important before we get started here to sort of underscore that some of the projections of the impacts of climate change along our coast are the kinds of things we're already seeing today, we've seen in the past, and also that our projections of climate impacts are based on a really profound understanding of the recent climate, especially based on observations of things like temperature. And this is a map I always like to show of global temperature changes over the last 140 years. This is from NASA, the cooler colors being cooler, the warmer and warmer. It's a 5-year moving average. And this is really an incredible data set, 6,000 weather stations across the globe, shipborne instruments, atmospheric measurements. This is just a perfect example of our understanding of how things are changing and gives us a lot of confidence in how things are going to change in the future. So I think it's important, as the denier community has been really successful in conveying their message that things aren't changed and nothing to worry about. As scientists, as policymakers, we have to continually repeat these same messages over and over and over again. We have this incredible array of observations. We know how the climate has changed in the past. While models aren't perfect, we have a very good idea of how things are going to change in the future. So why does temperature matter in terms of sea level rise? Well, as the Earth warms, the ocean warms, ocean water expands. This is called the steric effect. And this has accounted for about half of the observed sea level rise over the last century, about 4 to 5 inches or so. And then the other major contribution is the melting of land-based ice. So this has been in large part mountain glaciers over the last century, but now we're starting to see more and more melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. And this is important because there's about 250 feet of stored sea level rise in these ice sheets. So this is kind of begs sort of urge to action to really try to suppress temperatures to keep as much of that ice on land as we can. So the whole concept behind the Paris Agreement was to stabilize global temperatures at about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. We're about 1 degree now. But our current trajectory, based on the emissions and the temperature observations, the trends, is that we're going to blast right through that ceiling in about 10 years or so. We're going to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we're going to keep on going. So why does this really matter for sea level rise? Well, we know if the whole system equilibrates, as it did in the last interglacial 125,000 years ago, known as oxygen isotope stage 5e, temperature was about 2 degrees warmer than it is at present, but sea level was about 26 feet higher. So it won't happen in a century, it won't happen in 2 centuries, but even if we stabilize temperatures at about 2 degrees, we'll eventually get about 26 feet of sea level rise. And there's currently about 700 million people living in that zone across the world. And how quickly can it happen? Well, we've seen the very recent geologic past. Since the last glacial maximum, we've had periods where we've had as much as about 16 feet of sea level rise a century. So we know it can happen with much less warming. There's still a lot we don't understand about the whole interconnected climate system, but we're getting better and better every day. But most projections, if you're going to Vegas and you want to put odds on how much sea level rise we're going to get, it's probably about 3 feet over the next century. But the state is asking communities to plan for as much as 10 feet, which is sort of a high-end, sort of very low probability, but obviously very high-risk situation. Now, again, we don't have to look into the future to understand the kinds of impacts to expect. We've had these in the very recent past. We had them during El Niños, during these very large storm events. We've built our infrastructure right on this razor-thin edge along the ocean margin, and so we placed ourselves in harm's way. We don't need sea level rise to get some significant impacts. And what's going to happen is that these large storms we experience on a periodic basis, the impacts are just going to be exacerbated as the base level, sea level, keeps rising and accelerating, as it will. There's examples all over California, all over Santa Barbara, Ventura counties, of very recent impacts and what things look like during significant storm events, and the kinds of things we're going to see more and more frequently as sea level rise goes up. Okay, so at USGS, we built a coastal storm modeling system to try and assess the exposure of communities to sea level rise and storms across California. And so based on this really robust instrumental record, observational record, we take these models and project it into the future. We grab the latest global climate models to develop a future wave climate. Then we bring in the tides, the storm surge, the river flows. We model how the shoreline changes through time, how the cliffs retreat through time. Integrate all this into projecting future flooding and coastal erosion hazards over the next century across California. And this gets served up in a couple of viewers, the Arcoast, our future viewer, which you may be familiar with. And then also we translate this into socioeconomic impacts. So try to give communities a way to consistently across the state look at the impact of sea level rise and storms for any given region at very, very fine resolution to support local planning. So the take-home message from all we've learned from a very large body of peer-reviewed literature and then a lot of the local and regional studies that a number of us have performed is starting at the very high level. We know there's about 1 billion people will soon live in a coastal zone across the world. Like I said, there's about 700 million people today. On the West Coast, there's about 30 million people living in coastal counties. And roughly about 3% of those people are going to be exposed to daily flooding by 2100. So one of the take-home messages here is that flooding is going to increase exponentially with sea level rise, not in a linear fashion. And so what you're going to see is sort of once-in-a-lifetime flooding event is going to occur about every single year by mid-century. But I think even more profound is to consider that your average high tide of 2100 will be the same as today's once-in-a-lifetime event. So by the end of the century, the most extreme event today is going to happen every single high tide in terms of water levels. Okay, and it's really important to consider storms and how the coast evolves through time. And what we've shown is that when you consider that the coast is dynamic, which we know, we all visit the coast, it changes on an hourly basis, the potential impacts are about 3 times greater than if we just use a very, very simple bathtub approach. And that's what's really spawned a lot of the modeling in California, from TNC, from ESA, from Rebel Coastal, from USGS, is to really look at this from a dynamic perspective. Now, a summary of our work throughout California is by the end of the century, we have a little bit over 500,000 people and about $200 billion in property at risk. Probably the better metric, though, is to look at the percentage of GDP. It's about 6% of GDP, so that's a really, really huge number. It's something to be concerned about. And let me just also preface this by saying that this is based on if we do nothing, we don't defend, we don't adapt, we don't apply green infrastructure. This is assuming that everything is as it is right now. Now, about 2/3 of these impacts are very low-lying estuaries, rebuilt estuaries, places like reclaimed estuaries like San Francisco Bay, like Foster City. But also there's lots of low-lying communities along the California coast. Even though it's a high relief coast, we've built up a lot of our infrastructure essentially in estuaries. If you think about Carpinteria, you think about Long Beach, you think about all these areas in San Diego County, they're basically used to all the estuaries, and we built on them and they flood, and we wonder why things are flooding. Now, also to translate this into something that we can wrap our head around a little bit more, is these kinds of impacts we're talking about are about 10 times greater than the worst wildfire seasons we've had in California history, the worst earthquakes we've had in California history. Those range between about $10 and $20 billion. We're talking about annual impacts from sea level rise, if we do nothing, about $100 billion. During an extreme event, about $200 billion. So this is a very, very big issue that we have to tackle and start strategizing now. So in addition to the people and some of the property, there's also major potential impacts for our transportation network. We're talking about the regular flooding of thousands of miles of roads throughout the state. 3 major international airports. SFO is currently spending about $50 million to build up their levee system, and I think have a projection they're going to spend about $500 million over the coming decades to continually build up their levee system. San Diego Airport is the other one that's extremely vulnerable, along with Oakland. But there's also key components of our energy infrastructure in the line of fire, like the decommissioned San Onofre Power Plant. Many, many dozens of water treatment facilities, almost all of which are right at sea level. This is Hyperion in Los Angeles. And then the ports of LA and Long Beach, the largest port complex in the country. This port complex supports about 3 million jobs across the nation. And so one thing we don't know, we can kind of assess what's in the hazard zone, but what happens when you interrupt the flow of goods and services in a major port like this? What kind of trickle-down effect does that have on the economy? That's something people are trying to wrap their heads around a little bit more. rising sea level. This is something also that's really important to understand. It's very natural. We've always had, even when the shoreline was 10 or 20 kilometers offshore during the last glacial maximum, there are always beaches. The beaches migrate across the continental shelf. As long as they don't get stopped by something that is immovable, we're always going to have beaches and shorelines. The problem is that we built up this heavy infrastructure, this hard infrastructure along the coast. The shoreline naturally is going to migrate landward, but if it runs into a wall, it's going to be drowned. That's the kind of situation we see in lots of parts of the state, like Capitola Beach, like Goleta. In some cases, we've hardened it. It's called coastal squeeze. The beach has nowhere to go. It gets drowned. So that's something else we have to think about how we're going to manage that. And these issues are further exacerbated by the fact that we've reduced sediment supply to our coasts. We've put in lots of dams, we dredge, we mine the sand. Sand is the second most consumed resource in the world after water. The demand for sand is high, so to think that we're just going to maybe engineer our ways out of this, we're going to find enough sand to protect the beaches, is going to be a really, really, really big challenge. So across some of the shoreline models we've done for Santa Barbara area suggest we have an average erosion of about 75 meters or about 80 feet or so by the next century. A lot of these beaches don't have 80 feet, so you're going to lose these beaches. Maybe as much as about 3/4 of these beaches are simply going to be lost as they're pinched between either hard infrastructure or the cliffs. And to talk about the cliffs for a second. So basically, cliffs retreat during rainfall and also when waves hammer at the base of the cliffs. And so with sea level rise, this wave energy is translated from the landward. This sort of hammer with these waves are just going to hit the cliff more and more frequently. The rates of cliff erosion are going to retreat, are going to increase significantly. In some cases, maybe as much as double, depending on the amount of sea level rise. And we have a lot of infrastructure built on the edges of cliffs, like UC Santa Barbara. We don't have room for these kinds of cliff retreat rates. Some of our transportation corridors, like 101, are also going to potentially be impacted by these higher rates of cliff retreat, which go up by about 50% with 1 meter sea level rise, or roughly double for some higher end scenarios. And so all this information is pushed out here close to our future viewer. A lot of people like to go here and play around. Here's the link. You can go mess with it anytime you want. We have all the scenarios, the sea level rise, the storms. What people like to do is pick a place that they like Santa Barbara Harbor, start clicking through scenarios and try to identify where the tipping points are, where things start to go south, identify weaknesses in the urban infrastructure where maybe you need to shore up the defenses or think about more green adaptation options for a particular region. And then we translate this into socioeconomic impacts in this viewer here. And what we found over the next century based on the modeling work is that in Santa Barbara County, we've got a little over 10,000 people at risk and about $3.5 billion in property. Present day, there's about $600 million in property at risk of a storm right now. So it's not like there's nothing that's in harm's way at the moment. And just to emphasize again, it's really important to consider extreme storms when you're looking at future vulnerability, not just the bathtub. So it's not just the people and it's not just the infrastructure. There's also a very rich ecosystem in these beach systems that it's really important that we understand the vulnerability there. And Jenny Dugan led this work along with Monique Myers and tried to integrate the physical impacts with ecological impacts. And so there's lots of microfauna, lots of macrofauna in this very narrow coastal, narrow beach ecosystems that is extremely vulnerable as these beaches get thinned out. And what we found in this work is that about more than 70% of the loss of beach habitats by 2050 and the loss of wetland habitats. So ecosystems are going to be going first, and then the physical. So we have to keep a close eye on this in the very, very near term. That's the first sort of system that's going to be severely threatened. Okay, I thought I was going to finish on time, but no, I'm not. I'm sorry. One other thing to consider too is we think about strategically about how we're going to adapt to climate change, the fact that we can build giant walls, but we also have a very, very shallow coastal water table. In places like Miami, we're seeing this now every high tide. We're seeing flooding in neighborhoods as the water table rises with the tides. And even though it may be defended from overland flooding, we're seeing regular flooding. This is certainly a potential issue in California. And we're about to build out, release modeling which shows the vulnerability of where the water table may intercept the surface across the state due to sea level rise, so complement that with the overland flooding. The basic concept is that as sea level rise goes up, the water table goes up at some rate as well, and it could potentially flood areas, even that aren't connected to the ocean, but have very shallow, low-lying areas where the water table will intersect the surface. And so just a quick example from Pacifica. On the left shows overland flooding by end of century due to an extreme storm. On the right is the groundwater depth, and so it's already very, very shallow. If you add 1 meter of sea level rise, this is just every single day, the water table is going to start intercepting the surface long before you have an extreme storm or even that amount of sea level rise. And so this is something we have to consider as well. This is why they're pumping tens of billions of dollars into pumps in Miami right now. Okay, so it just kind of begs this question of how we're going to respond to these different threats. You know, the sort of the traditional way is to elevate, block, restore, get out of the way, and groundwater is going to present an additional challenge. Okay. Now just try to move into how we communicate some of this science more effectively. You're going to see some really cool stuff from Giuliano as well. But this is a virtual reality simulation from Capitola to try to really let people know what future sea level rise and storms look like. Instead of seeing a 2D map, and I have the goggles here, I can show people later what this looks like. You can picture this could be Carpinteria, this could be Pierpont, any of these low-lying beaches in the state to simulate what sea level rise and storms will look like. So I'll just let this puts a little bit more perspective, the kinds of things that we can anticipate in the future if we don't do anything. That's a little bit depressing, and so we've also done some VR type work with the city of Santa Monica. This is another just really quick example, it's not a video. We have these, these tourist type binoculars at the beach, and if you look through them, this was a demo, it's no longer up, you see what the future will look like. And so in this case, this is the old shoreline was way, way back there before we put tons and tons of sand on early beaches. But this is present day. This is what sea level might look like by the end of the century. So you look at this view, you click through. This is the next scene you get. This is what sea level rise plus a storm might look like in the future. But then here's an adaptation option that you might consider that could really, curb some of these impacts. We're going to talk a lot about solutions today, and hopefully not too much more about some of the depressing possibilities if we don't do anything. So with that, for our own work, we're wrapping up the California coast for the next year or so, building this across the North Coast. Cosmos exists everywhere else, and also moving toward a national scale coastal flooding map in 5 to 7 years using this science. And we really are encouraged and hope that California has been a great example of how science can be used to inform policy and to direct policy, and that people actually use science to make decisions. I think we're in a brave new world, but that's not always the case. So we hope that we can start moving this work across the country and really keep pointing to California as this place where things are getting done. They're listening to science, they're moving forward, they're being progressive, and making smart decisions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. The slides will be available too, so if you didn't write everything down, you said capture it that way. I just want to circle back to the principle of bringing your whole self and bringing your emotions and your spirit into the room. That was a lot of information, and a lot of it is full of grief. There's a lot of emotion there, and I think we're tempted in a situation like this to compartmentalize that, to put that aside, and just to try to be rational about it. I don't think that's appropriate or healthy, and I don't think that's how we're going to be able to move forward effectively with this kind of work. So we'd like to take a brief exercise now, a moment or two to do an exercise to invite in that emotional reality. What I'm going to ask you to do in just a minute is to, with a partner actually, first I'm going to ask you to reflect. Let's just take a minute to reflect on that and to give ourselves some space to let the emotion in, the grief, the full range of feelings about what Patrick just shared. I'd love to ask you to reflect a little bit on your relationship now with the sea, the shore, our beaches, our islands, and what feelings come up when we face the reality of sea level rise and what it will mean for our home here by the shore. And what I'd love for you to do now is to do that in community. So if you turn to someone next to you, we're going to pair up, and I'll give you each a couple of minutes. I'll ring the bell when the first person's time is over. Before you start, one moment. What I'd like to ask you to do is that one person will share first for 2 minutes, and the other person's job is simply to listen. Try to be fully present for what the other person's sharing. Listen in a way that I think we often don't have a chance to do, or we don't take the time to do. Be fully present for that person. And then after I ring the bell, we'll switch. The second person will share, and the first person will listen. All right? Find a partner and share.